of Schaeffer doesn't, is kind of detailed analysis of a particular issue, which is important in some ways, but not for the purposes of our class. So we were talking about 5 and 6, right? We went through all these issues, but we didn't get to the tzaddik, and I think that's an important issue, so we need to talk about that for a second. Tzaddik just means righteous. And it refers, in a general sense, to a righteous person. However, in mystical circles, it comes to mean kind of a super righteous person, a saint, in other words. That is, a person who keeps all the commandments, has the highest spiritual attainment, has mystical knowledge, and therefore has power, has spiritual power, like he can work miracles and heal people, read your soul, and things like that. Okay? So it's called a tzaddik. So that the tzaddik, in other words, is a mystical master. Now, the veneration of the tzaddik occurs during the lifetime of the guy. So, for example, Menachem Schneerson of the Lubavitcher Chabad movement was highly venerated as a teacher, healer, mystic, etc., and also was believed to be the Messiah. So these guys are given lots of honor during their lifetime. Any question you have about your life, you go to the tzaddik and ask him what to do, that type of thing. The dead tzaddik is believed to have spiritual power. He still lives, lives in the afterlife, and he can intervene on behalf of the living and give blessings to the living. And so the way one way you do this is by going to the tomb of the tzaddik and, praying there and touching the tomb and things like that, and you get this spiritual blessing from that. This is based in part on the idea of 2 Kings 13:21, where a dead person, his body falls off or something, touches the bones of Elisha, and he's raised from the dead. Okay? So the idea here is that the bones of a very holy guy, Elisha would be a tzaddik by the mystical standard. He performs this miracle. Okay? So these become very important figures in Kabbalistic lore. So Isaac Luria is a tzaddik. He's the founder of this Lurianic movement. And we'll discuss Zohar on Monday, which isn't in the Schaeffer book, and we'll discuss Luria on Wednesday. Just kind of have an add-on discussion. It's not in the Schaeffer book. Okay, everybody understand the idea of tzaddik? So when it says righteous person in Unterman, it's frequently tzaddik. Sometimes it's more generic, just a guy who keeps the commandments or something. Now, in terms of nature of man, first of all, important thing to note, women and children can't be Kabbalists in traditional Orthodox teachings. Number one, women just can't be Kabbalists at all, and children are not spiritually developed enough to get into it. You basically have to be a man, you have to be learned in the Talmud, and you have to be 30 or 40. It depends on the tradition, but so you have to be, mature. Okay? Now that's different than Islamic tradition, although within Islam and Christianity, most mystics have been males. There are female Muslim and Christian mystics, so bear that in mind. This is kind of unique. I don't know of any female, today there can be female Jewish mystics, right, in neo-mysticism in the 20th century, but I'm talking about classical traditional stuff. Now, everybody understands that the body and the soul are separate, and it's kind of like the Christian idea, but there are kind of different types of souls within Jewish mysticism and different parts of souls and stuff. So they have a complex I don't know what you'd call it, animology or soulology or something like that. Okay, and it talks about the vital soul, which is essentially the life force, and the higher soul, which is kind of like the intellect of the Neoplatonic movement. Notice another idea here is Jews and Gentiles are different. It's not just the Gentile is a guy who's not a Jew but could become a Jew. Their souls are different. The Jews have a different type of soul, a better, superior soul. It was very interesting once I went to Menachem Schneerson's place. This is in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, in New York. And you take the subway out there, and they've got a big, his old house has been turned into a shrine, kind of like a tzaddik shrine. And you go in there, and they have, museum, here's his books, here's his clothes, here's his chair, all that type of stuff. And I went in there, and because I speak some Hebrew, I was talking to the guy, and he thought I was Jewish. And so he started telling me all this stuff about how Jewish souls are better than Gentile souls. And, I was, oh, that's interesting. And it was just going on and on about this. So, I mean, it's not just that you happen to not be Jewish. There is a fundamental spiritual difference between a Jew and a Gentile. Yes?
So then in this tradition, they would not accept converts at all? I know it's difficult, but...
During most of this time, nobody was converting to Judaism. That is to say, it was persecuted, it was, isolated, and the non-Jewish people didn't like them. It was against the law to convert, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so there's conversion's not a big issue. It doesn't become an issue maybe till the 18th century with the liberation of the Jews. So you don't see it much during most of the mystical period that we're talking about. In theory, you can do it. I mean, the halakha talks about how to convert to Judaism. So. Okay? Now, you're also not supposed to teach the Torah to Gentiles. Now, this is part of the Jewish isolationism. We talk about how during the Middle Ages the Jews were isolated and they lived in ghettos. And ghetto in Jewish term, the ghetto was a quarter of Venice. And so the Jews lived in the ghetto. It didn't mean it was a slum. It meant it was that part of town. And it came to mean the Jewish quarter in all towns. So ghetto wasn't necessarily like a slum. In medieval Europe, it could be a nice place to live, but it was an isolated quarter where all the Jews lived. Now, in some way, the Christians made the Jews live there, and in another way, the Jews chose to live there. They wanted to isolate themselves from the Gentiles. Okay, and so you're not supposed to, for example, teach Torah to the Gentiles. This is part of the Jewish isolationist idea. And the main reason for this is probably they don't want Jews to convert. That is to say, the problem of conversion from Judaism to Christianity or Islam during the Middle Ages was a significant problem. And so if you try to teach the Jews Torah, they might convert you, whereas you can't convert them because, laws against conversion to Judaism and stuff. Does that make sense, how that worked? Now, the idea of silence is another one. Basically, there are two forms of silence. There is disciplinary silence, in which the disciple simply has to be silent and not ask questions. That is, he just observes and tries to learn and develop, and then at a certain stage he becomes an advanced disciple, and then he can start questioning. But initially you just obey the master and you just listen to what he has to say. So there is that type. That's the silence that a disciple shows to a master. It's not always, it's just a certain phase of spiritual development that you are living in silence. And you'll find that in some other mystical traditions as well. Okay? The other one is silent prayer, silent meditation. Now, notice Jewish prayer is usually out loud. If you go to a synagogue, or Orthodox synagogue, you go to the Western Wall, everybody's praying, and they're praying out loud. Now, it's kind of a mumbled out loud prayer, but nonetheless, they're doing it out loud. So silent prayer is not the norm in Judaism, but there is kind of a mystical form of meditative prayer that you might want to do. And we've got, here's a little bit about the difference between the nefesh, which is the life force, and the neshama, which is the personality, the intellect, or the higher soul. He calls it, I think, the higher soul, Unterman. And there's this other idea of shell. It's kapil or kapilot, and it means literally a shell, like a shell of a nut. But what it refers to is the matter that encases the soul. And so this is a Lurianic idea, and we'll discuss Isaac Luria on Wednesday. But you'll see the mystics, the Jewish mystics, talk about it a lot. Okay? Any questions on that chapter? So what I'm doing is just kind of going through these ideas to kind of clarify some of the stuff. Am I repeating things that you already get, or is it good for me to go through and clarify these ideas? Okay? I don't want to, repeat things that you already got, but I'm trying to pick out things that are either really important, crucial ideas, or ideas that he talks about that may or may not fully make sense. So, am I going into too much detail, or is this about right?
I think it's fine.
Okay. Now, he has a chapter on rituals. What's the difference between a ritual and a law in Judaism? Or a commandment? Well, the difference is that all laws or rituals are commandments, but not all commandments are rituals. So one of your commandments might be to give money to the poor, but another is to say a prayer at a certain time and place. Okay, so a ritual is kind of a set, organized, systematic, often communal thing that you do. Now, the rabbis came up with 613 commandments that they drew out of the Torah. Of those, a whole bunch are ritual commandments centered around the Israelite temple system that existed in the ancient Bible. The rabbis couldn't perform those anymore. So what they tended to do was perform some of the rituals that were able to do without the temple, and then transformed the rituals they couldn't do into something else, usually prayer or some other type of more simplified ritual. Like sacrifice gets commuted into prayer. We can't offer a blood sacrifice because we don't have a temple, but we'll offer a prayer, and that will serve as a sacrifice. Does that make sense? So that's one aspect of rituals, is there are essentially the allegorization and transmutation of the sacrificial temple system of Israel into a mystical system. The second is that the allegorical interpretation of the ancient rituals, turning them into having a mystical meaning. So if you read the Bible, God wants animal sacrifice because he likes the smell and he loves the gift or whatever. I mean, it just says God likes to get blood sacrifice. It repeats this several times in the Old Testament. Number one is the rabbis couldn't do it, or not the rabbis, the mystics couldn't do the sacrifices. And secondly, the sacrifices didn't make sense with their interpretation of mystical stuff. That is, if you've got this God that is Ein Sof and he's completely transcendent, why does he want a blood sacrifice, right? Why does he want a cow burned up? So what they do is mystically interpret all of these things. So there is both the transformation from sacrifice to prayer and the mystical interpretation, so that an ancient sacrifice was allegorically something else. Now, some of the rituals survive, like circumcision, prayer, fasting, things like that. So they did continue some of them, but a lot of them were lost. Now, the story of the circumcision of Isaac Luria is an important one. We're going to talk about him on Wednesday, but notice that Elijah, number one, people get circumcised as the mark of the covenant. And when they talk about God and stuff, they'll point out that he's circumcised. So that Jews are in the image of God, but Gentiles aren't, because they're not circumcised. So they'll say things like that.
Even though God is not in the form of man?
Well, the Adam Kadmon aspect of it.
Right.
Okay? Okay, everybody understand that? But what we got here is Elijah coming. So Elijah comes when Isaac Luria is circumcised because he knows he's going to be the super mystical master. And so he essentially participates in this with him. So there's lots of Elijah stories with Elijah popping up here, there, and either sometimes he comes as a stranger, sometimes he's unseen, sometimes he meets these guys and they're walking along and they're chatting, and it's not till he's done and left that they realize it was Elijah, that type of stuff. Now, ecstatic dancing is a characteristic of at least the Hasid mystics. Remember, there's Haredi, which are Orthodox Jews, and one branch of those are the Hasidim, and they are what means pious. And these guys are associated with the best Baal Shem Tov. And Baal Shem Tov said dancing is a mystical practice, so they're dancers. They dance all the time in terms of mystical dancing. If you've been to Jerusalem and go to the Western Wall on Sabbath, you'll see a bunch of groups dancing, and those are Hasidic types. I went to the Yad Bomer at it is the festival of the death, I guess, of Simeon Bar Yochai, where they have this huge festival where they make bonfires and then everybody gets drunk and dances around the bonfires. This is a mystical thing. He's the author of the Zohar. Okay, so I mean, dancing's a big deal with this. You don't see dancing explicitly in the Old Testament as something associated with the temple rituals, although you do see David dancing before the Lord when they bring the Ark of the Covenant in. So there's something going on there, but it's not discussed in any detail. There certainly was dancing at the temple. And by the time of Jesus, the Mishnah quotes about the water drawing ceremony. This is at the time of Sukkot. They go down and get a bunch of water from the spring of Gihon and bring it up to the temple and pour it in the basin to use for whatever things they're doing. So they're bringing up water, and it is meant to symbolize the rains and the coming of the rains. So it is essentially a symbolic request of God to send the rains in the fall. And at that, the Mishnah says they were dancing, that they take torches and they do torch dances around the temple courtyards and stuff. Okay, so you still see some of that going on. Everybody knows about kosher food, right? Okay. Now, your average Jew would say, well, we don't eat kosher food because it's impure and we're not supposed to eat it. It's a commandment. The mystical Jew will make up all sorts of mystical meaning behind the kosher laws. Okay? But the fundamental issue is it makes you pure so you can have the presence of God with you. So this purifies your interior thing by not taking impure things inside your body. This purifies your exterior body by immersion in a pool of water, which purifies you from, say, sheep dung that got on your shoe when you're walking around or something. I mean, it could be anything, right? So notice, purity law is very important to the mystics. Lots of mystics don't care about this. For example, Hindu mystics, they do all sorts of ritually impure acts just to prove they're transcended the ritually impure. Like they'll go cover themselves with ashes of cremated people or something. I mean, they'll do all sorts of strange stuff. But the Jewish mystics are usually concerned about purity laws. And they're also concerned with the commandments. Mitzvah, mitzvot, or commandments. But they all have a mystical significance. So you don't just do it because God told you to. You do it because God told you to, and He told you to because it has some mystical spiritual impact on you. Okay? Same thing with prayer. Questions on any of that? Now, he talks about two other issues, sacred space and sacred time. And what they're talking about there, sacred space is initially the temple and then the synagogue. And then even beyond that, it could be like the room where the mystics meet and bring down the power of God into the room, or the tomb of a tzaddik. Those could all be sacred places. It starts out at the temple, though. And he mentions this idea that the earth is spherical. That's found in the Zohar, which dates about 1300 AD. Why would the Zohar think that the earth is spherical? Because everybody thought the earth was spherical. I mean, when we talk about Columbus convincing people the earth was round, everybody knew that. All the scholars knew that. The peasants thought it was flat, but anybody who was a scholar knew that. It's found in Greek writings. It gets passed on in the Middle Ages. When you read Dante, the earth is spherical. And it's really an essence of Ptolemaic geography, because the center of the cosmos is the earth, which is a big sphere, and it has around it a bunch of spheres. If the earth were flat, you couldn't have spheres around it. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, it's part of the whole cosmology of the era. From that derives then the idea that Jerusalem is the center of the sphere. Now, it's on the surface of the sphere, but all things are measured from Jerusalem. And this, again, is also in Dante. Jerusalem, in medieval maps, you'll see Jerusalem as the center of the earth. And they say Jerusalem is the heart. Okay, in Hebrew, this is Lov, and it means the heart as an organ that beats, but it also means the heart like the core, the center. Okay, so when they say heart, sometimes they mean center. And the heart of the earth is the place where God dwells on the earth, and the heart of the human is the place where God dwells in the body. So this is microcosm, macrocosm symbolism. You guys, did I explain what microcosm and macrocosm are? Okay, so everybody understands that? Body's microcosm, small model, small cosmos. Earth is macrocosm. They parallel each other. Now, so that's one idea here. The other is the third temple prophecies. What's going on there? What was the first temple? Solomon's temple. What happened to it? Destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Then they went off for 70 years in the Babylonian captivity. They got freed by Cyrus, went back. All of this is in the Old Testament. And rebuilt the temple around 515 BC. So that's the second temple. And it's sometimes called Herod's temple because that's the best documented part of that. But Herod actually completely rebuilt the temple, tore down the old one and rebuilt it. So first temple is from Solomon, 964 to 586. Then there's a gap. Then it's from 515 to 70 AD. At that point, the temple's destroyed by the Romans. Now, there were actually a couple of attempts by the Jews to rebuild it, but none of them got off the ground, and the rabbis basically ignored these because they were failed false messiah type movements. And so for the rabbis, there is a belief that there will be a third temple, that it will be rebuilt and restored. What's that belief based on? Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48, which describe the rebuilding of the temple after its destruction by the Babylonians. Okay? So this is preserved, and basically the assumption is that the Messiah will come at the end of days and will rebuild the temple, restore the kingdom. He will be a descendant of David and therefore restore both the high priest and the kingship, and you'll have then the Messianic age. So there's a strong component of Third Temple ideology. This gets broken down, however, into two different theories of Third Temple. What are they?
Is it that the one thinks that you have to be the ones to enact it, that they're going to be the ones to start it, and the other one is that God will
right.
do it?
So theory one is that the people have to get together and rebuild the temple, and then the Messiah will come. The other is the Messiah will come, and a sign of the Messiah is the rebuilding of the temple. So there's two theories. One is an activist, the other is a passive, right? The activist is, we got to get out and rebuild the temple. And there's groups like this running around Jerusalem right now, who are agitating for the rebuilding of tearing down the Dome of the Rock and rebuild the third temple. Other groups say, we just have to wait and let God will do it somehow. He'll send the Messiah and it'll get rebuilt. And a lot of those groups say it'll come down from heaven. It'll descend from heaven. It won't be built by humans at all. Okay? Now, there's a good passage in here from the Zohar that talks about the celestial temple and how the earthly temple is a copy of the celestial temple. We've talked about that idea before. Everybody understands that, right? But the thing to note here is there's also a heavenly and earthly synagogue and a heavenly and earthly yeshiva. So the original idea was there's a temple in heaven and it manifests itself as the temple on earth. When the synagogue, this is heaven and earth. As you go through time, the synagogue becomes the center of rabbinic life, not the temple, because the temple's destroyed. What's left is the synagogue. And so they essentially say, okay, well then there's a synagogue in heaven too. And what we do in the synagogue is our synagogue is modeled on the synagogue of heaven. And then you get the idea that there is a yeshiva, which we'll explain in a second. And so that comes to the idea that there's a yeshiva in heaven. Now, what's a yeshiva? It means a school, and it's the place where they study Talmud and Jewish law and scriptures and all that type of stuff. So usually a yeshiva is a room attached to a synagogue. It'll be a kind of a complex building. You have a big synagogue hall where everybody meets and prays on the Sabbath, and then there's a room next to it that's the yeshiva. It's got a library, a bunch of books, tables, and people sit around and argue and debate things. In really small communities, they use the synagogue hall for the yeshiva. That is, they do it in both. So a big community would have their own synagogue and a different yeshiva. And so you'll read in the mystical writings a lot about the yeshiva in heaven, where the dead rabbis have all gone to heaven. And of course, heaven is arguing about the Talmud and the Torah all day long, right? I mean, what could be better than that? Because that's what the rabbis love to do. So you'll see these guys up there, and there's kind of debates in heaven, and then they'll figure it out, and it will confirm or reject a particular rabbi's interpretation of issues on earth. So, heavenly temple leads to the idea of a heavenly synagogue, and that leads to a heavenly yeshiva, which is kind of connected to the synagogue. Okay? Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so the synagogue is just, they had them all over before the temple was destroyed. It was just not that important, right? Until
right.
The temple was destroyed, then they became the major thing.
Synagogue is a place, it's actually a Greek term. It means a place of gathering together, gathering place. In practical terms, they had gathering places way back in temple times where they just get together and, pray, study, talk, have civic affairs. They were often the courtyards around the city gates often served that function. By the time of Jesus, in fact, a century or two earlier, they're having synagogues as meeting places. And it kind of starts in the diaspora where the Jews are no longer around the temple, and they buy a house or build a house or use somebody's house as a meeting place, and then it gets turned into a kind of a formal institution. And when the temple's destroyed, what's left are these diaspora synagogues, so they become the central institution for Judaism. So initially, they're more or less practical buildings for, carrying on community business and prayer and study and whatnot, and then become the central institution of Judaism when the temple's destroyed and everybody's living in diaspora. Everybody knows what diaspora is? Scattering of the Jews outside of Judea. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Questions on any of that? Then we've got the sacred time idea. And that is basically that certain days are more holy and important than other days. And this is based anciently in archaic Israel as on the observation of the heavens, the phases of the moon, and the movement of the stars and the equinox and the solstice and all sorts of different things. The observation of the heaven creates a calendar, and the calendar is marked by sacred days. In the lunar cycle, there were 4 sacred days of 7 days each, that is the Sabbath. But there were other sacred days like the fall festival of Tabernacles, where that would occur in relationship to the fall equinox, and then in the spring equinox it was Passover time. Not on the equinox, but it was kind of measured from those. Like, what's Easter? first full moon after first Sunday after the first full moon after the equinox or something like that. I mean, that's how it's measured. That's why it rotates around. So there were different ways of doing this, that there were some debates about this. But for our purposes, what you get among the rabbis is the predominance of the Sabbath. It is the supreme sacred time. And then number two, the celebrating the other festivals like Passover and Tabernacles and stuff, and New Year's, with special non-biblical things that you do. So it's kind of building up a new tradition to do special things on certain holy days. Okay? Now, all Jews did this, but of course the mystics interpreted it all mystically, right? So, for example, the idea of the Sabbath bride. The idea is Israel's the bride, and they meet the bridegroom, the Lord, on the Sabbath, and they kind of have these songs they sing about the wedding, of the Lord and Israel and things like that. This gets turned into then a big mystical interpretation of the Shekinah and so forth by the mystics. So it's in some things they do their own unique stuff in the rituals, but generally it is the communal rituals of the Jews interpreted to have a special mystical meaning. Okay? Now, what about asceticism among Jewish mystics? What's asceticism, first of all?
Practice of depriving yourself.
Right, it's kind of depriving your body of food, sleep, sex, water, fasting, sleep deprivation, whatever. Its purpose is to suppress the desires of the flesh so that you can focus purely on spiritual things. You see that idea reflected in Jesus fasting 40 days in the wilderness. You see it in Jesus saying the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. The flesh kind of prevents the spirit from achieving its spiritual goals, those types of ideas. Fasting originated in the Bible as an act of mourning and becomes an act of repentance and then becomes an act of piety. Now, the important thing to note is asceticism is a widespread mystical phenomenon, but in Judaism it is limited in some ways because there is no sexual asceticism in Judaism. For example, among Christian mystics, you'll see chastity as a mystical virtue. That's largely because these guys were monks and nuns that were involved in this, and having a vow of chastity was part of their life. In Judaism and Islam, you won't see that because the mystics were married. And Judaism, in fact, turns the Sabbath into a super mystical day on which the mystic, will have sex with his wife as a spiritual practice. So having the mystics having sex on Friday nights they would sometimes not do it the rest of the week, but only do it on Fridays. And so that was a way to increase and enhance the spirituality of the Sabbath. So it's kind of counterintuitive in some ways. If you turn to Indian mystics, on the other hand, there are sexual ascetics in Hindu and Buddhist mysticism, but there's also a movement called Tantric Hinduism and mysticism in which sexual activity is done in order to produce mystical ecstasy. So, it's a complicated relationship between those types of things. But for the Jews, sexuality was a commandment, right? It's one of the mitzvah. Multiply and replenish the earth. In fact, it is the first commandment God gives. Well, yeah, it's the first. Multiply and replenish the earth, right? And then he says, don't eat of the tree of knowledge. But the very first one is to do that. So for the Jews, not doing that is breaking the first commandment. So there's always complicated relationships between sexuality and mysticism in one way or another, but the Jews have this particular twist on things. Any questions on that stuff? I didn't bring my watch. What time is it? So we got 5 minutes? Man. Okay, I think we covered all the Unterman chapters, and so we're just going to do Schaeffer's 7's what's left. And we won't spend much time on this, but there are a couple of things you need to get. Everybody knows the difference between Yerushalmi and Bavli. What he's talking about here in chapter 7 is Talmud. And he's comparing and contrasting what the Talmud is this big collection of commentaries on the Mishnah and the Tosefta and so forth. There are two versions, the Jerusalem and the Babylonian. The Jerusalem is smaller, and a lot of it's the same, but there are some distinctions. So he's looking at the distinctions between what the Jerusalem Talmud says about mystics and the Babylonian Talmud. Okay? The thing to note is, first of all, this idea. Does exegesis, that is the study and interpretation of Scripture, reveal mystical knowledge? According to the mystics, yes or no? Yes, absolutely. However, there's another mechanism to get mystical knowledge, and that is ecstatic experience, visions and dreams and stuff. So the rabbis agree we should do proper exegesis, but they're worried about this because this leads to all sorts of, speculations and erratic behavior and so forth. Okay? So exegesis is a spiritual act through which the mystics believe they can attain mystical knowledge. And that's an important thing to note. The second thing to note is the rabbis generally didn't like the mystics. Why not? Because they claimed a higher source of knowledge than the rabbis had. The rabbis' authority was because their master had told them, and he had learned from the master, and you go back. You have this chain of authorities. Rabbi said, Rabbi X said, Rabbi Y said, Rabbi Z said, and then he told me, and there's the law. Comes from that, comes from tradition. The mystics say we can interpret the Scripture through ecstatic revelation. And that threatens the rabbis, right? Because their authority of we learned it from the oral tradition is threatened by a mystic who can get it direct from God. So you'll see the rabbis kind of downplaying this. For example, here's a passage. Why do you students want to know what is hidden? That is the secrets, the mystical knowledge. Why do you investigate that which is deeper than the netherworld? This is what is below. Remember, there's what is 4 things you cannot study. What is above, what is below, what is before, what is after. And these are eschatology, creation, heavens, and the underworld. Okay? Reflect upon what you have been given permission. That is halakha stuff, law. For what is hidden is not your business, not your concern. Don't study those things. Sometimes you'll hear Mormons say things like, don't study the mysteries, right? I don't know if people are saying that anymore, but maybe religion guys will tell you, don't study the mysteries. That's the same attitude, okay? It's just going to get you in trouble. You won't understand it, and you'll get it confused, you'll get messed up, and you'll. So, the other thing that he talks about here is, well, he mentions that there's a polemic against the mystics. That is to say, there's a hidden undercurrent of anti-mystical stuff among the rabbis. They don't like it. They fear it. And they fear it because, in practical terms, it led to heresies. It led the guys claiming all sorts of stuff and disrupting the synagogue. I had this vision and it said to do this. And, the rabbis say, sit down and shut up. You're confusing everybody, right? And then they get in a big argument. I mean, it doesn't take much to get the rabbis to argue. And, you get some of this stuff going and their argument will never end. So So it was a disruptive social force. When they were trying to create community, unity, social order, the mystics were disrupting that. And so they didn't like it, and they're rejecting it quite a bit. Now, we talked about the stringing method, right? Does everybody remember what that is? It's important to note that what this amounts to is the literary and historical decontextualization of the text. That is, you can extract a verse completely out of context and connect it with another verse that has the same word or even a gematria the same, and then interpret it in relationship to each other and completely ignore the context. Now that's the exact opposite of what's called today the historical critical method, which focuses on trying to get you to understand the original context of the text and interpret it based on that context. But this allows huge leeway. The stringing method allows huge leeway into interpreting a text, which then the mystics can go wild, right? They can do what they want. Now, we'll talk about this two powers issue. That's an important one. And then we're basically done with Schaeffer 7. So we'll move on to the next topics, which is, the pages that I revised readings for Monday and Wednesday that I put up on the blog.